Hi and welcome to Crash Course Catholicism, a podcast about Catholic teaching and why it makes sense. I'm your host, Caitlin West. Hey friends, welcome to this third episode in our little mini-series on the philosophical proofs for the existence of God. So, in our last two episodes, we looked at Thomas Aquinas' 5 ways, and in this episode, we're going to go beyond those arguments to talk about some other popular proofs for God's existence, including the Kalam Cosmological Argument, the fine-tuning of the universe, the argument from consciousness, and even Pascal's wager. So we're going to cover a range of approaches to this question of God's existence in this episode. And I want to begin with a reminder to all of us that we have a lot of freedom in terms of which of these arguments we like or that we find the most compelling. It's not like these philosophical proofs are dogmas of the Catholic Church, right? And one of the reasons why I think it's a good idea to go through as many of these arguments as possible is because different things are going to appeal to different people. So one person might really, really like the Kalam argument, whereas another person might hear that argument and think, oh, well, it's fine, but I find it really hard to wrap my head around. Whereas the fine-tuning of the universe, okay, that makes way more sense to me and I find that compelling. And that's totally okay. That's actually great. It's not like there's one perfect philosophical argument that all Christians have to like. There are many ways of thinking about and approaching this question. It's kind of like a castle with different paths leading to it. So this episode is going to be a kind of a smorgasbord, and I encourage you, across all of these episodes on God's existence, if there's an argument that you come across that really excites you, then go down that rabbit hole. Go find out more about it, and don't feel like you have to have a perfect grasp on absolutely every argument that we discuss. Okay, so with that said, let's get started with the Kalam Cosmological Argument. Now, this argument actually has its roots in medieval Islamic theology. So it's been around for a while, but it was kind of popularized in recent decades by a Protestant philosopher named William Lane Craig. William Lane Craig, side note, actually wrote a fantastic book called Reasonable Faith, which is an introduction to Christian apologetics. So I really recommend it for anyone who's wanting to do some more kind of broad, general reading up on apologetics and arguments for God's existence. But the Kalam argument specifically has been kind of William Lane Craig's particular thing. He's the guy who revived this argument in modern philosophy. So the Kalam argument is a cosmological argument. So that means, just like Aquinas' first 3 ways, this argument begins with an observation about the world around us and then argues from that observation to a first cause. So let's take a look at the basic shape of the Kalam cosmological argument, and then we'll go through and unpack it step by step. So the argument essentially has 3 steps. It goes like this. Whatever begins to exist has a cause of its existence. The universe began to exist. Therefore, the universe has a cause of its existence. And that's it. That's the argument. Now, at first glance, this might seem like a really simple, straightforward argument. And there are definitely parts of it that are simple and straightforward. For instance, that first point is fairly self-evident, that whatever begins to exist has a cause of its existence. That's an observation about the world that pretty much everyone agrees on, including people who don't like or agree with the Kalam argument. So we discussed this in one of our previous episodes, the fact that nothing brings itself into existence. It's a logical impossibility. In order to bring something into existence, I first have to exist. And I can't exist and also not exist and then bring myself into existence. That's a nonsensical idea. So that first point we can kind of intuitively grasp. Whatever begins to exist has a cause of its existence, and that cause is not the thing itself. However, things start to get a little bit more controversial once we hit the second premise of the argument, which is that the universe began to exist. So, remember how when we were talking about Aquinas' first way, we said that an infinite temporal series of causes, so a series of cause and effect that stretches back in time forever and ever and ever infinitely, is at least theoretically plausible. Well, the Kalam argument actually challenges this idea. It proposes that a temporal series of cause and effect cannot actually be infinite. In other words, no matter how long the universe has existed for, at some point, it has to have come into existence. It hasn't always been here. Okay, now, there are two different ways that we could try to show that the universe has to have come into existence at some point. And those two ways are through science and through philosophy. So the scientific kind of branch of this argument uses empirical knowledge and scientific discoveries about the universe and its origins to argue that the universe had a beginning point. For example, we might point to the second law of thermodynamics, which basically states that over time, things run out of usable energy. So if the universe had always existed, there's no beginning point, then it would have run out of usable energy or reached a state of what we call heat death by now, meaning that the conditions necessary for life wouldn't exist anymore, and therefore we wouldn't exist. But we do exist, and the universe hasn't run out of usable energy. Therefore, it must have had a beginning point. Another thing that people will turn to is the theory of the Big Bang, and the fact that the universe is expanding, which points to it having a specific beginning point. So that's this kind of scientific arm. And then the philosophical branch of the argument basically uses logic and reason to argue that the universe cannot have always existed because, as the argument goes, an actual infinity like that is impossible. Okay, we've just used the phrase an actual infinity. So let's just pause and figure out what that term means, because it's important to understand if we're going to grasp this argument. Philosophers tend to refer to two different kinds of infinity: potential infinity and actual infinity. A potential infinity is an infinity that only exists either in the abstract or in the future, potentially. So for example, in mathematics, we can talk about infinite sets of numbers in the abstract. Or if I started to count from 1 to infinity, that's a potential infinity because there are a bunch of numbers that I haven't yet counted to. An actual infinity is different because it's an infinity that currently actually exists here and now. It's complete in its totality. It's not something that is still developing or something that only exists in the abstract. So an example of an actual infinity would be a bank account that has an infinite number of coins in it here and now. Okay, it's complete all at once. It's not still growing or unfolding or in the abstract. It really exists here and now. So if the past were infinite, if it had no beginning, then that would be an example of an actual infinity, because it would mean that an infinite number of moments in time has already occurred in reality. The past doesn't exist just in the abstract or in the future. It's a real concrete, completed sequence of events. Now, proponents of the Kalam argument would state that this kind of infinity, an actual infinity like that, can't exist in the physical world. So why is that? Why can't an infinite past exist? Well, some philosophers use thought experiments and analogies to show how actually infinite sets lead to weird paradoxes and contradictions. So there's a famous thought experiment called Hilbert's Hotel. Hilbert's Hotel is a theoretical hotel that has an infinite number of rooms in it, and every single room in the hotel is occupied. So there's an infinite number of people in the infinite hotel. Let's say that a new guest arrives and they want to check into the hotel. Well, there's an infinite number of rooms, so that's fine. All you have to do is move every other guest down one room, and then you would create space in the first room to fit the new guest in. Now, already we have something counterintuitive happening because we've said that the hotel is full, but we've also said that it can always take in a new guest. Now, let's say that everyone who's staying in an even-numbered room in the hotel checks out. So the hotel has an infinite number of even-numbered rooms. So that means that an infinite number of guests have just left. So how many guests are still in the hotel? Well, there is still an infinite number of odd-numbered rooms, so that means that there's still infinity guests in the infinite hotel. In other words, in this instance, infinity minus infinity equals infinity. So that's weird. Okay, now let's say that the fire alarm goes off in the hotel, which means that everyone has to evacuate. So now we have an infinite number of guests leaving the hotel and we have no more guests inside. So in this case, infinity minus infinity equals 0. But we've also just said that infinity minus infinity equals infinity. So which one is it? So these are the kinds of paradoxes that come up when we start playing with infinite sets of things. And someone like William Lane Craig would argue that these paradoxes reveal the impossibility of having an actually infinite set of things that exists in physical reality and not just in the abstract. And if it's true that an actually infinite set like this is impossible in reality, then that means that the universe can't have existed for all eternity. It must have had a beginning. Now, some philosophers will push back on this and argue that actual infinities are absolutely possible in physical reality. It's just that they're counterintuitive and they behave in weird, paradoxical ways. But that's not the same as them being logically impossible. Just because actual infinities are like mind-bending and weird, that doesn't mean that they cannot exist. And some of these philosophers who are pushing back are Catholics, by the way. Like, this isn't a theist versus atheist debate. This is actually a disagreement among people who might all agree that God exists and that he created us. But when it comes to the Kalam argument, they take different views. In fact, Thomas Aquinas himself rejected the idea that we can prove through logic that the universe had to have a temporal beginning. He argued that the only reason we know the universe had a beginning is because of divine revelation, and not because it can be proven through reason alone. And so this is like a live question in philosophy. There's no kind of settled consensus among all philosophers and apologists on whether or not we can logically prove that the universe began to exist purely through reason. So if you are like a super nerd and you want to like roll around in this question, then I'm going to include some links in the show notes to debates between other super nerds just like you, like Trent Horn and Jimmy Aiken. So you can like pop off if you want to go down that rabbit hole. But for now, just for the sake of explaining the argument, we're going to accept that premise that the universe came into existence at some point. Okay, now if the two premises that we've covered are true, that whatever begins to exist has a cause, and that the universe began to exist, then it follows that the universe must have a cause. Something or someone brought the universe into existence or caused its existence. And of course, the question that follows from there is, what is that cause? What brought the universe into existence? And of course, it's tempting at this point to just jump straight to God. God must have caused the universe. But we're not going to do that, because that would be what we call a God of the Gaps argument, where we see something that we can't explain and we immediately just jump to divine intervention without considering other explanations. So let's look at some of the other explanations that people have come up with. Some people accept that the universe had a beginning, but they suggest that that beginning wasn't the result of some kind of, God or deity, but instead it was part of some other larger process that exists beyond our universe. So one idea that some philosophers have proposed is that the universe exists in a kind of eternal cycle of expansion and contraction. So it's part of a cosmos that kind of dies and is reborn over and over again, kind of like a cosmic phoenix. So yes, the universe came into existence, but only as part of this kind of eternal, permanent process of death and rebirth that doesn't require a creator, it's just always been here. Another theory is that a multiverse exists. In other words, our universe is just one of a potentially infinite number of universes that all arise out of some kind of higher dimensional reality. So these are some of the speculative proposals that people have come up with to answer the question of what caused the universe to come into existence. The problem with these explanations is that they don't fully answer the question. Instead, they just kind of defer the answer. They push it back one step further. Even if the universe is part of a cycle of death and rebirth, or even if there is such a thing as a multiverse, both of which are possibilities that are totally compatible with the Catholic faith. We can accept those theories, but they don't offer us a definitive explanation of why the universe exists, because they themselves require explaining. What caused that cycle of death and rebirth? Why does matter exist in the first place? Who created this multiverse machine that's burping out all of these universes? At some point, like with all of the cosmological arguments, we arrive at a point where this chain of cause and effect has to hit a ceiling. We require some necessary being that just exists per se, that is existence itself, and that isn't part of the reality that we're trying to explain. So here we can go back to the analogy of the Rube Goldberg machine from the OK Go music video that we talked about all the way back in episode 2, where in this video a hand comes into the frame and sets off a row of dominoes, and then that row of dominoes sets off this whole series of chain reactions. When we talk about a cause of the universe, we're not talking about the first domino. We're talking about the hand. We're talking about something that exists above and outside of matter that isn't just another level of the same reality. And this is what we mean when we talk about God. Okay, so that's a summary of the Kalam Cosmological Argument. Now let's move on to a discussion of another argument for the existence of God, which is the argument from design. So broadly speaking, the argument from design is basically the idea that the universe is so unbelievably complex that it must have been designed by an intelligence. It can't have just spontaneously come into existence by chance. So there are many versions of this argument, but one of the most compelling versions focuses on what we call the fine-tuning of the universe. So what is the fine-tuning of the universe? Well, it refers to the fact that the basic conditions of the universe, so the building blocks of reality, things like the laws of physics, the strength of gravity, the mass of particles, the rate of the universe's expansion, all of these fundamental conditions are precisely set to allow life to exist in the universe. If even one of these conditions was slightly different, then the stars wouldn't have formed, planets wouldn't exist, and life as we know it would be impossible. And when we say if one of these conditions was slightly different, we're talking about a margin that is so small that it's almost impossible to imagine, a fraction of a fraction of a fraction of a fraction of a fraction, on and on and on. So let's look at a couple of examples. Let's start with the strength of gravity. If the strength of gravity varied by even 1 part in 10 to the power of 60, so that's a 1 followed by 60 zeros, then stars either wouldn't have formed at all or they would have burned too quickly for life to develop. Now, to get a sense of how big that number 10 to the power of 60 is, the number of grains of sand on all of the beaches on Earth is roughly 10 to the power of 20. 10 to the power of 60 is 40 orders of magnitude bigger than that number. So in other words, if we took all of the grains of sand on Earth and we multiplied them by a trillion, and then we selected one single grain of sand, that grain of sand represents how slightly the strength of gravity would have had to have varied in order for life as we know it to be impossible. So it's like if we had a dial with 10 to the power of 60 possible settings on it, and only one of those settings allowed for life. The strength of gravity had to be set exactly at that point. Another example we could look at is the cosmological constant, which governs the rate at which the universe is expanding. If the cosmological constant had been different by even 1 part in 10 to the power of 120, then the universe would either have expanded too quickly for galaxies and stars to form, or it would have collapsed back in on itself. So to give us a sense of how enormous that number is, if we took the number of seconds that have passed since the Big Bang and we multiplied that by 1,088 times, we would have a number comparable to 10 to the power of 120. It's like a number so big that we can't even comprehend it. And if the cosmological constant had varied by 1 part in 10 to the power of 120, then life as we know it would be impossible. So we could go on and on and on with more of these constants that all have to be precisely tuned for life to be possible. And if even one of them was slightly out, then life in the universe wouldn't exist. And the fact that the universe is fine-tuned for life is actually something that scientists generally agree on, regardless of whether or not they believe in God. So for instance, Stephen Hawking, who was famously an atheist, wrote the following. He says, "The laws of science as we know them at present contain many fundamental numbers. The remarkable fact is that the values of these numbers seem to have been very finely adjusted to make possible the development of life." And I think very finely adjusted might be the understatement of the century. It's mind-bogglingly, unbelievably finely adjusted. So the question isn't so much whether or not the universe is fine-tuned. That's generally accepted. The question is why. Why is it so finely tuned? And again, people have come up with various theories, one of them being the multiverse, another one being that we're all living in a computer simulation. That's a genuine philosophical argument that people have made. And like with the Kalam argument, these theories don't fully answer the question because, again, they kind of defer the problem by another step. Other people just dismiss the whole question entirely and they say, well, fine-tuning might be wildly improbable, but it happened. So that means that the probability is 100% and we don't need to interrogate it. It's like if you rolled a 10-sided die 100 times in a row and you came up with a random sequence of 100 numbers from 1 to 10. The likelihood of that specific sequence of numbers coming up is technically astronomically low, but that is the sequence that you came up with, and you had to come up with something, so there's no kind of why about it. Now, the problem with that response is that, when it comes to 100 random dice rolls, every combination is going to be equally probable, and none of them is inherently kind of special or important. They're all just random kind of sequences of 100 numbers. But the fine-tuning of the universe isn't like that. It's more like if there was only one specific sequence of 100 numbers out of all of the possible ones that would allow for life to exist. And any other combination would mean that the universe remains a lifeless void. So you have to roll this 10-sided dice 100 times, and every single time you have to get the exact number that you need. And if you get one number wrong, then life is impossible. The odds of hitting that precise life-permitting configuration of numbers by chance are insane. And the outcome is unique. It is significant compared with all of the other possible kind of configurations of numbers. So the fact that we ended up with exactly the right conditions demands an explanation. It's not just any result that we got from 100 dice rolls. It's the only result that allows for life to emerge. Now, of course, a logical conclusion that we can come to when we encounter the fine-tuning of the universe is that it was done deliberately. It wasn't random. This universe is not the product of chance. And if it was deliberately created, then that implies a creator, an intelligent designer, that deliberately generated a universe in which life was possible. Now, that option might be mind-boggling or weird or difficult to get our heads around, but that doesn't make it impossible. It is at the very least a reasonable inference to make when we see the fine-tuning of the universe, that this was done deliberately. This wasn't just blind chance. So the fine-tuning of the universe is probably the most compelling version of the argument from design. But one other argument that is just worth mentioning because it comes up a lot is William Paley's Watchmaker argument. Now, the Watchmaker argument is one of those arguments that is really attractive to some people because it feels so straightforward and clear and compelling. However, when we look more closely at it, there are some issues with it that can make it a less than helpful approach to the argument from design. So I think it's a good thing to be aware of. So let's just quickly go through it now. So the Watchmaker argument goes like this. Basically, if you found a watch lying on the ground, the intricacy and complexity of its design would immediately lead you to assume that it had a maker. You wouldn't just look at a watch and think, oh, that's just assembled itself randomly or it's appeared by chance. In the same way, when we look at the universe and we see its complexity, we immediately assume that it must have had a creator. Now, there is a clear appeal to this argument because it highlights the complexity and the order that we find in the universe. And it suggests that that order demands an explanation. However, many philosophers, both Christian and atheist, have pointed out that there is a key flaw in the Watchmaker argument. And that is that yes, nature and a watch are both ordered and complex, but the ways in which they are ordered and complex are different. The order that we find in nature is intrinsic, whereas with a watch, order has been extrinsically imposed on it. Okay, so what the heck does that mean? Well, in order to make a watch, you have to take a bunch of separate parts, right? Bits of like metal and things that don't naturally belong together, and then assemble them into something functional. So the order of the machinery doesn't come from within the parts themselves, it's imposed on those parts by a designer or a watchmaker. But when it comes to nature, that complexity arises from within the things themselves, right? The parts kind of all belong together. They flow from each other. They work together towards natural ends. So for example, a seed will grow into a tree, or the organs of the body will all kind of function together. The order of nature isn't imposed on it from the outside. It's kind of built into the things themselves. So for that reason, we can kind of come up against some problems when we compare the universe to a machine or something like a watch. One thing we can do, though, is we can hone in on the fact that nature does have this kind of intrinsic internal order to it. Like, that's a remarkable fact that we shouldn't overlook. So instead of comparing the universe to a watch, we can just compare it to itself and say, well, hang on, how is it that we have this world where things work together in such an ordered way? And that's precisely the argument that Thomas Aquinas makes in his fifth way, which we covered in the last episode. Okay, so that's the argument from design. Now, before we finish up, let's power through a few kind of shorter arguments for the existence of God. One of these is the argument from consciousness. So the argument from consciousness states that the human capacity for conscious experience, so our imaginations, our ability to reason and to make free choices, these things cannot just be explained by physical processes. So let's say that we assume that the universe is just a bunch of mindless particles that are following physical laws. Well, mindless material can't account for the kind of intangible, immaterial experience of rational thought. Like, pure matter can't think and it can't reason. So how is it possible that our own thinking and reasoning arises purely out of matter? It's kind of like if you had a tap that was connected to an empty dam, but water was coming out of the tap. Well, if there's no water in the dam, then the rational conclusion is that there must be some other source of water that isn't the dam. So in the same way, pure matter doesn't contain consciousness or intelligence. So for that reason, we need to look for another source of human consciousness and human intellect. So human beings have a capacity for thought and reasoning that transcends material processes. So to help us get our heads around this, we can compare human thought processes to the functioning of a computer. If we think about a computer that generates the image of an elephant, every part of that process is kind of material. So the electric signals, the coding, even the image of the elephant itself is projected onto a physical screen and is visible. So it all occurs within the realm of matter. But when a human being imagines an elephant or pictures an elephant, part of that process is material, so the action of my brain sending out electric signals, but the elephant itself isn't tangible. It only exists in my mind. And when I say it exists in my mind, I don't mean that if you cut my brain open, you would find an elephant in there. We mean that it exists in some non-material sense. Or if we replace the image of an elephant with a concept, something like the concept of justice or truth or love, these concepts exist in my mind, but like, what do we mean when we say that they exist in my mind? They're not material realities, they are metaphysical ones. So that's what we mean when we say that human consciousness transcends purely physical processes. And the question then follows, where does this human consciousness come from? That intellect, the imagination, the will. If it doesn't arise solely out of matter, then what does it arise out of? And the logical answer is that there must be some immaterial, intelligent source of our intelligence that exists above and beyond matter, just like the water that the tap is drawing from. And that points us towards what we call God. Okay, now speaking of transcendence and things that point us beyond matter, another argument for the existence of God is the argument from aesthetic experience. Basically, it's the idea that our experience of beauty in the world points towards something higher. Peter Kreeft puts it perfectly, as always. This is his summary of the argument from aesthetic experience. He says, "There is the music of Johann Sebastian Bach. Therefore, there must be a God. You either see this one or you don't." I love it. It might sound a bit flippant, but actually, it's really true. Our experiences of beauty in nature or in art or in architecture or literature genuinely reveal the transcendent to us. Because it's not just that these things are like aesthetically pleasing to us. I mean, there are plenty of things that are aesthetically pleasing that don't point us towards the transcendent, like a nice pair of sneakers. But true beauty reveals an order and a truth that points beyond the material thing itself to something higher and intangible. When you look at something truly beautiful, it's like peering into a portal that transports you somewhere else. I was recently in New York and I went to the Metropolitan Museum of Art, and there were like a bunch of Van Gogh paintings in there. And there was this one Van Gogh painting that was just a pair of shoes. And I was literally standing in front of this painting looking at it and I was like, why am I crying? Like, this is literally a painting of a pair of shoes, but something about it just like set off this ache in my heart and I was just riveted. And when we have these experiences, it's like a finger that's pointing straight up, or like crumbs that lead us to the castle. They open our hearts and minds and they point to the reality of some transcendent goodness and beauty. It's like a pathway to God. Okay, and then last but not least, let's talk about Pascal's wager, because this is one that comes up fairly often. Pascal's wager is an argument that people tend to have like very strong opinions about. They either love it or they hate it. So let's start by summarizing the argument, and then we can talk about the ways that it can be useful and not so useful. So Pascal's wager is an argument that was formulated by a philosopher called Blaise Pascal in the 17th century. And it goes like this. And I'm paraphrasing, but this is the shape of the argument. Let's say that you're trying to decide whether or not God exists. So you've done all this reading and thinking and you just can't come to a definite conclusion. It feels kind of 50-50. And maybe it is impossible for you to know for sure whether or not God exists. At this point, you basically have a two-sided coin, right? It's either heads or tails. God exists or he doesn't. And there's a 50-50 chance and you have to place your bets. And you do actually have to place a bet. Like, there's no way to sit this one out. Choosing not to decide is in itself a decision, right? To live as though God doesn't exist. Okay, so you can choose to live as though God does exist or as though he doesn't. Now, what happens if you choose to live as though God does exist? If you're wrong about that and he doesn't, then okay, what have you lost? At worst, maybe you've given up a few kind of like comforts or pleasures along the way. But in the end, you die, and that's that. You go into oblivion, and it doesn't matter. And on top of that, you've kind of lived your life trying to be a good Christian person, so that's great. But let's say you're right, and God does exist. Then what you would gain from that is something infinite, eternal joy and union with God forever in heaven, which makes really any earthly sacrifice that you would make completely worthwhile. Okay, now let's think about the opposite. What if you chose to live as though God doesn't exist? Well, let's say you're right and he doesn't. Then great, you've lived your life how you wanted and it's no problem. And again, you're going to die and go into oblivion and it doesn't matter. But if you're wrong, if God does exist and you lived as though he doesn't, then you may actually lose something infinite. You might lose the very purpose that you were created for and the chance for eternal happiness. So if those are the options, So if those are the options, then it makes sense to choose God, to live as though God exists, because you're not losing much and the possibility of gain is enormous. Now, probably most of us hearing this argument are immediately thinking of all the problems that might arise with that. Basically, some people hear this argument and they think, well, first of all, this isn't convincing. This hasn't convinced me that God exists. They might also say, that's a really dishonest and intellectually lazy way to live your life, right? Just to say, oh, well, I'm just going to turn my intellect off and live as though God exists because just in case, like, what if he does? I remember I had a friend when I was at uni who was an atheist, and he told me once that he became an atheist on the day when he overheard his mum telling the neighbor that she was a Christian for insurance purposes. And he was like, oh my gosh, that's such a morally bankrupt way to live your life. Like, oh, I guess I'm a Christian because just in case. Now, if Pascal's wager is, first of all, a proof for the existence of God, like if Pascal is trying to prove to us that God exists through this argument, then he's doing a terrible job, okay? This doesn't prove that God exists. And if Pascal is trying to encourage people to just switch off their intellect and just be Christian for insurance purposes, then that's also not a great argument. However, we need to be clear on what this argument actually is and what it's trying to do. Pascal is, first of all, he's not trying to prove that God exists. This isn't a philosophical proof for the existence of God. Instead, what Pascal was trying to do with this wager was he was trying to speak to people who were in a state of agnosticism. That is, they weren't absolutely convinced either way. They weren't sure whether or not God exists, but they were kind of open to the idea of it. And he was basically saying, okay, if you're not sure, why don't you give it a try? Like, why don't you try just praying or try living in a way that reflects Christian principles and just see how you go, because you have nothing to lose and everything to gain. In other words, he's kind of encouraging people to take Christianity for a test drive. All it means is that we can keep our intellect switched on, we can keep asking questions, we can keep pursuing truth. All we're doing is living it a go. So having a go at saying a prayer, or going to church, just going to church and seeing what it's like, or picking up the Bible and reading it, or consciously trying to live in line with the 10 Commandments. And we can totally do that with our brain switched on while still asking questions, while still trying to reason through it. And if this is how we approach Pascal's wager, not as an invitation to blind faith, but instead as an invitation to just try out, test drive Christianity, then I think that can be valuable. And the reason why it can be valuable is because belief in God ultimately goes beyond intellectual arguments. It is more than just an idea or a concept. It is a personal encounter. It's a relationship with a being. At some point, our faith needs to incorporate not just the head, but also the heart and the soul. So if we're struggling with the heady stuff, we can keep that struggle going, but we can also literally just say to God, okay, if you exist, show yourself to me. I'm going to try praying. I'm going to try living in line with Christian principles and just see how I go. That's not a dishonest thing to do, provided that we're clear about the fact that this is part of my search for truth. Okay, now one final little caveat that I want to make about Pascal's wager before we leave it is we've said a couple of times that, you have nothing to lose by just trying out Christianity. What could go wrong? Just give it a go. Well, I think we also need to be sensitive to the fact that for some people, they actually would have a lot to lose by even trying out Christianity. Like, that's a big thing for someone to try, depending on their circumstances or their situation in life. So I think we need to be very sensitive. It's not the kind of suggestion that we should go around sort of flinging at people in conversations. But for someone who is kind of wrestling with the philosophical arguments and they're not sure where they stand, it can be helpful to just be reminded that it's okay to give it a go, like to dip your toe in, even if you're not 100% sure yet, and just see how you find the experience of living Christianity. Okay, cool. So that's an overview of some common arguments for the existence of God beyond Aquinas' 5 ways. And again, I encourage you, don't worry about taking every single one of these in, but if there's anything in there that strikes you as exciting or interesting, then go pursue that and think further. There will be links in the show notes so that you can read up on this stuff or watch or listen to things and go deeper into any of these arguments if you would like to. Sweet. In our next episode, we're going to tackle the best objections to belief in God and how we might respond to those objections. Sweet. Okay, cool. Well, I hope you have a fantastic fortnight, and I can't wait to talk to you soon. Okay, bye. Change your mind, I'm the first in line. Honey, I'm still free. Take a chance on me. If you need me, let me know. Gonna be around. If you got no